Here's a story. A few years ago, I decided to try to learn Polish. Now, it turns out that learning Polish is not like learning the languages we learned in high school: French, German, Spanish. It's a lot harder than those. And it's very hard to get started on your own. So I looked around for a class. Now, you'd think that in a city like Boston, here where I live, all the great universities, you'd be able to find a Polish class. You'd be wrong, or in any case, you'd find out that it's not very easy. Eventually, I did find what looked like a good possibility. There was an organization, I think it was called the Boston Foreign Language Institute, and it was in Kenmore Square in Boston. And one night, they had an open house. They'd advertised this open house, and they also advertised a list of the languages they taught, and one of them was Polish. So I attended that open house, and it was great. The teachers and the administrators were all there dressed to the nines. There was a nice spread for us visitors, which included this great apple cider based punch. I mean, years later, I remember this. This was really good stuff. And I met the Polish teacher, and she seemed very nice, and she was a native Polish speaker. She had university training in teaching foreign languages, and I thought, what could be wrong with this? And I signed up on the spot. And the class was set to begin some 3 or 4 days later. The next day, I got an email from the Boston Foreign Language Institute. I just scanned it very quickly, and it was clear even at a glance that they were telling me that the Polish class was canceled. And I assumed, well, just not enough people signed up. Then I thought, let me read it more carefully. I want to see, was that in fact the reason? And I read it more carefully. And that was not the reason. What was going on was that email was announcing to me that the Polish class was canceled because the entire school was going out of business as of that moment, as of my reception of that email. And all I could think was, geez, I should at least have gotten the recipe for that apple cider punch. In any case, I finally did find a class. We were a small class. There were just two of us students and the teacher. It was a pretty good class, I think. The class was held in the Boston Public Library one evening a week, and we held the class in the seating area of the library cafe. We sat at a small round table, the three of us sitting around a table like that. And because this was in the evening, the cafe was closed, and they had a divider wall, one of those accordion walls that you can use to divide a large room in two, for example. And they had that accordion wall closed so that it separated the seating area from the kind of the business end of the cafe, where they had the counter and the kitchen and food preparation and so forth. So we could sit there in the cafe seating area, and we could look through this divider wall because the panels were glass. And we could see that indeed there was no one over there in the food preparation part of the cafe. But I can tell you that, let's see, this class met maybe 10 or 12 times. It's 10 or 12 consecutive weeks in the evening. Every one of those classes, when we looked through that glass wall into the other half of the cafe, we could see mice running around in there, scurrying around to and fro. Sometimes they weren't even scurrying, they were just walking like they owned the place. And our teacher was inventive. She knew how to use context in her teaching. So we learned how to say things like, regard the rodent over there. Proszę patrzeć na tamten jedzenie. Or, I am afraid of mice. Boję się myszy. Well, that little story about learning Polish situates us on a circle. Let me show you what I mean. Share the screen. And I think you can see a circle with 6 stops around the edge of the circle. And we are starting here now at the bottom of the circle where it says Polish, Polish for Polish language. And we are going to work our way around the circle. We're going to go counterclockwise. And at each stop along the circle, we'll have a little story or we'll have a little fun activity of some kind. And you see that our last stop is labeled kohelet, Ecclesiastes, the book of the Bible. Now, at each stop along the circle, there'll be something that points us toward the next stop, leads us naturally into the next stop. And that's going to be true at the end as well. When we talk about kohelet, it turns out that our discussion of kohelet will lead us naturally back to some final words about learning Polish. Now, you might think, well, how can that be? What does kohelet have to do with learning Polish? Well, stick around, you'll see. So as you see, our next stop on the circle is Yiddish. Now, how does learning Polish lead us into learning Yiddish, talking about learning Yiddish? Well, in both cases, it turns out that my motivation, one of my motivations, was that I wanted to connect to the language of my grandparents. Now, Polish was a language of my grandparents, my mother's parents. Yiddish was actually their main language. And a few years ago, I knew a little Yiddish. The Yiddish I learned, I took in a class where we used a book called College Yiddish. And that book was a traditional kind of language textbook. You know, each chapter had a little vocabulary section, a couple of points of grammar. There were no associated audio or video components to this. It was an old-fashioned sort of thing, but it was a very good book. And to this day, it's a useful book. Now, over the years, that book has been supplanted. It's not the book currently in fashion anymore. The book that is currently in fashion is a book called In Einem, meaning together. And that is a book that is published by the National Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts. And I'll tell you a couple of things about that book. Well, first of all, it's heavy. I mean, this book really weighs in. If it's not 10 pounds, I'll be surprised. It's got thick, glossy pages, like pages out of Vogue magazine. It's got a lot of audio and visual support, little video clips and audio clips that accompany each chapter. And flipping through the book, it appears to me that it's actually a very good book. I think it will be useful to me for me to try to maintain what little Yiddish I remember and maybe even improve on that. But there is one thing that's troubling, might be a little too strong, but one thing about the book that gives me pause, and I'll illustrate that for you. We'll share the screen again. So you're looking at a cartoon here, and that cartoon comes from the book In Einem. Now, what do we see? A little girl and her dog, they're in the park. They encounter a pirate. And the girl apparently doesn't notice this, but the dog notices that something's amiss. Shouldn't that be a parrot on the pirate's shoulder? Instead, it's a chicken. Well, this is cute. And this to me is the kind of thing that I can imagine would be useful in helping people learn a language. This is a forward-looking kind of thing. You wouldn't have seen a cartoon like this in that old book, College Yiddish. This is Yiddish for the next generation. But this is the problem I have. Yes, it's Yiddish for the next generation, but it kind of unmoors me from the Yiddish of my grandparents. This is not something my grandparents would have connected with. I can imagine them looking at this picture and saying, "Was ist das, a Pirat? Oy vey, das ist Meshuggah." It occurred to me, in fact, that as I thought about this issue, and it's not going to stop me from using the book, but it's an issue that I certainly noticed. And thinking about it, it occurred to me that, gee, even Socrates at heart sounds more like my grandparents than this little girl in the park with her encounter with the pirate. And let me illustrate that for you. I just took a little statement of Socrates out of Plato's Republic, and it reads like this: "The ones in power, when they make laws, might they not make mistakes now and then?" Well, you can hear it as well like this: "And the ones in power, seien gesund, they should only live and be well, but when they make laws, they might make little mistakes now and then." Yeah, to me, Socrates sounds more like my grandparents uh, than that cartoon we saw. Now, okay, the way I just read that is certainly not the official translation of Plato's Republic. So, I think I owe you some real Yiddish here. So I'm going to share the screen again, once again, and what you see here is the English translation of a Yiddish poem by the poet Moshe Leib Halpern. And I am going to read this in Yiddish, and you can look along, follow along with the English. Hat Moshe Leib sich niedergestellt, inmitten der Nacht zu der Trachten die Welt, hebt zum eigenem Trachten sich ein, schätzt in Emets in euer Arein, als als Ding ist gleich und als als Ding ist krumm, und streit sich die Welt arum als Ding arum. Zut Moshe Leib mit die Nägel a Streu und schmechelt. Von was? Mit glatter Zoi. Now, if you've been following, we've moved from Yiddish up the circle to Socrates. And now thinking about Socrates makes me think of other characters from Greek and Roman antiquity. For example, Sisyphus from Greek mythology. And that moves us yet another notch up the circle. You probably know the story of Sisyphus. There are different versions of the myth. They start off with Sisyphus committing some sin, and depending on the version of the myth, it may be a different sin he's committing, but they all end up the same way. Sisyphus, is sentenced to a peculiar fate. His sentence is that he's got to roll a rock up a hill. When the rock gets to the top, it's going to roll back down. He's got to push it back up again, and it'll roll down again, and back and forth like this forever, for eternity. That's his sentence. Now, one of the ways that people in olden times used the story of Sisyphus as a kind of object lesson goes like this. Don't worry about incurring the fate of Sisyphus in the afterlife. Who knows if there even is an afterlife? What you should worry about is don't live like Sisyphus in this life. For instance, if you have a job that's dull and repetitive and every day the same thing over and over, at least push back against that. Try to see if there's a way out, change jobs, do something to change your situation. Don't just settle for it. This kind of object lesson, this point of view was, for example, the point of view of the Roman poet Lucretius. Now, it was also the point of view that was adopted by the great Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai. And that brings us down another stop on the circle to the stop Amichai and Singer. And what we're going to do now is to look at a poem by Yehuda Amichai that illustrates this point of view that he had about the story of Sisyphus. So let me share the screen again. You'll see the poem in English, and I'll read it to you in Hebrew. Okay, you should see this poem now. It's a poem about being the mayor of Jerusalem. עצוב הוא להיות ראש העיר ירושלים, נורא הוא. איך יהיה אדם ראש עיר כזאת? מה יעשה בה? יבנה ויבנה ויבנה, ובלילה יקרבו אבני ההרים מסביב אל הבתים, כמו זאבים הבאים להלל על כלבים שנעשו לעבדי בני האדם, who have become the slaves of men. So let's come back. So we see that being the mayor of Jerusalem is, according to Yehuda Amichai in this poem, is a Sisyphus-like task. You can build, you can gussy up the city, you can modernize it, bring it into the 21st century, work all day doing that, but at night, rocks roll down the hill toward the houses. That's the Sisyphus image there. And that happens every night. And what does it mean? I think the point is that you can try to modernize Jerusalem all you want, but you cannot unmoor it. You cannot cut it off from its history. Jerusalem will always be Jerusalem. So we see that being the mayor of Jerusalem, that's exactly the kind of life that the Roman poet Lucretius is telling us we should avoid at all costs. You could call it unresolved Sisyphus-like behavior. But there is such a thing as resolved Sisyphus-like behavior, and I'm going to show you an example of that now. We see an example of that in the life of the character Gimple in the Isaac Bashevis Singer story, Gimple the Fool. So this is a story in which this character, Gimple, is beset all his life, every day of his life, by people playing pranks on him, playing practical jokes, lying to him, trying to pull the wool over his eyes in one way or another. And he tries to push back at times, like pushing a rock up a hill, but to no avail, because he wakes up the next morning and there's somebody else ready to play a prank on him again. It seems to just go on endlessly until at some point, when he's older, he has the following to say, and this is, I'll read from the story, and it's Gimple himself who's narrating this. After many years, I became old and white. I heard a great deal, many lies and falsehoods, but the longer I lived, the more I understood that there were really no lies. Whatever doesn't really happen is dreamed at night. It happens to one if it doesn't happen to another, tomorrow if not today, or a century hence if not next year. What difference can it make? Often I heard tales of which I said, now this is a thing that cannot happen. But before a year had elapsed, I heard that it actually had come to pass somewhere. I'm going to also read you the last two lines of the story. When my time comes, I will go joyfully. Whatever may be there, it will be real, without complication, without ridicule, without deception. God be praised. There, even Gimple cannot be deceived. So this is Sisyphus-like behavior that resolves. But either way, this kind of pointlessness, and again, there's more pointlessness in the case of the mayor of Jerusalem than there is for Gimple. But this kind of pointlessness points us toward our next stop on the circle, which is Kohelet, Ecclesiastes. And maybe you noticed that we heard echoes of Kohelet in all these readings, in the words of Gimple, in the poem The Mayor of Jerusalem, in the poem by Moshe Leib Halpern. And I'll read you some examples, some passages from Kohelet that bear out these echoes, or these moments that resonate with Kohelet. So first, here is a passage from Kohelet that echoes in the style of Sisyphus, the pointlessness of being the mayor of Jerusalem. One generation goes, another comes, but the earth remains the same forever. The sun rises and the sun sets and glides back to where it rises. Very clear similarity there. Now here's a passage that sounds very much like the first thing I read from Gimple, where he says, often I heard of something that, oh, that couldn't have happened. And then before a year passed, I heard that it actually did happen, that statement of his. So from Kohelet, Sometimes there is a phenomenon of which they say, look, this one is new. It occurred long since in ages that went by before us. And here's a passage that makes it seem that the voice whispering in Moshe Leib's ear might actually be Kohelet. Remember, Moshe Leib is up at night and he's thinking, and a voice whispers in his ear that everything is crooked and everything is straight and the world turns around and so forth. So from Kohelet, I observed all the happenings beneath the sun, and I found that all is futile and pursuit of wind, a twisted thing that cannot be made straight. But along with the echoes of these writers, you get something else in Kohelet as well. You get the sense as you read Kohelet that he thinks he's figured things out. That is, he seems to have arrived at his conclusions by processing his life experiences with intellect, but with intellect alone. So another passage from Kohelet. I set my mind to study and to probe with wisdom all that happens under the sun, an unhappy business. Now, in Gimpel's case, at the end of his life, it seems that something has dawned on him. In Kohelet's case, it seems that in his mind, well, how to put it, he's been around the block a few times. He knows what's going on in the world. Nobody's going to pull the wool over his eyes. And maybe an object lesson we can take away from Kohelet is that intellect alone is not enough. But if that's true, in what way exactly is intellect not enough? Well, I think we can illustrate this by doing a fun activity that has to do with a certain way that Kohelet is like the philosopher Immanuel Kant. Before we do the activity, I have to tell you that that sentence you just heard me say, it's the first time in human history anyone ever uttered a sentence that had fun activity and Immanuel Kant in the same sentence. So treasure that. Now, Kant wrote a book called Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone. Now, at some point in that book, he puts forth an argument that Judaism is inferior to Christianity. And at the end of his argument, he says the following: Judaism consists of ancient laws and dusty books, studied by dry old men. It should be laid to rest with those old men. Now, when I think about Kant, just his name, Immanuel Kant, I think of a certain kind of intellectual formidability. It actually reminds me of when I was a kid. At that time, when you went into a public library, usually they had on a wooden stand in there or a wooden table, they had an unabridged dictionary. Now, these unabridged dictionaries, these things were huge. These are massive dictionaries that you had to keep on the stand. If you're a little kid, you couldn't pick these things up. They probably weighed more than that in Einem Yiddish textbook that I mentioned. And they were, for me, there was a sense there of these books being daunting. There was intellectual formidability there. So if Kant were here, if he were sitting here with us, and I try to engage him in an argument to show him that, in his argument that Judaism is inferior to Christianity, the dry old man stuff, that's wrong. I mean, we all know it's wrong, but I don't know that I could prove it to him. He'd be probably be referencing other philosophers and technical terms that I don't know. I think he could trash me in an argument. No, even though I know he's wrong, I don't think I could defeat Immanuel Kant in an argument. But I think my mother could. I think your mother could too. And that's going to be our fun activity. So what you need to do here is close your eyes and imagine yourself as a child out walking with your mother. Now you see an old woman with a bag of groceries trying to cross the street. Your mother says, "No, go help that woman. Go, toddler. It'll be a mitzvah." So now your mother's used the Yiddish word mitzvah, which means mitzvah, means commandment. One of the ancient laws, so-called, that Kant was referring to in the dusty old books. Okay, so now let's imagine expanding your mother's statement in two possible ways. Now, first of all, it's possible your mother was saying this. This is option one. "No, go help that woman. Go, toddler." It's one of the 613 commandments of Judaism that are presented in the Talmud and amplified and codified in subsequent rabbinical teachings. Or she might have been saying this. This is option two. "No, go help that woman. Go, toddler. It's a nice thing to do. It's the right thing to do. It's the kind of thing you should learn to do without being told as you grow older." So, which version represents what your mother was saying? Option one or option two? Well, certainly option two. But does that mean your mother doesn't know what a mitzvah is? Is it possible Immanuel Kant knows what a mitzvah is and your mother doesn't? Of course not. Your mother knows perfectly well what a mitzvah is, and here's why. Jews who recite the Shema twice a day, which is a mitzvah after all, they say the following line from Deuteronomy. "V'hayu hadvarim ha'ele asher anochi mitzavcha hayom al levavecha." And these words which I command you this day shall be in your heart. In your heart, not in your mind, not in some dusty books where Kant seems to think they are, not on some ledger sheet where you can check off whether you've done them or not, but in your heart, which means that the precepts of Judaism are vibrant and alive. They are at least as much of the heart as of the mind. They are precepts of love as much as, or more than, precepts of logic or intellect. In other words, we don't use the word law in the dry, purely legalistic way that many other people use it. Now, considering what Kant had to say concerning ancient laws and dry old men, he didn't know that. And so with this observation, we see that your mother has laid old Immanuel to rest, and kohelet along with him. So your mother knows Judaism is about heart. But where exactly does heart get you? Well, among other things, heart gets us back around the circle to where we started, to the stop where it says Polish, where we talked about learning Polish. And what does that have to do with heart? Well, one of my main motivations for wanting to learn Polish was to connect back to the loving memories I have of my grandparents. That's a matter of the heart. Still, you might say, "Oh, do you have to reconnect that way? Why learn the languages, the language of those Schlechter? I mean, what they did with their Nazi-like behavior, how can you learn their language?" Well, that's a fair question, actually. So let's imagine then back in Poland in those days, you think maybe there were 50 good people in Poland at that time? If not 50, you think there were 40? How about 30 or 20? Right, let's agree on 10. I'm sure you'd admit there were 10 good people in Poland back in those days. And what did it mean that they were good people? They helped Jews. They saved Jews. They hid Jews at the risk of their own lives and risking the lives of their families as well. And sometimes they lost their lives. Well, you know what? Polish is their language too. So I learned a little Polish, and if you remember what I said, it was very little. But we went to Poland, my wife Sheila and I. She had a conference there, and we found a lot more than 10 good people. For example, there's an organization in Warsaw, mainly of non-Jews, and they go out to the countryside, they go to little towns, they talk to young school children, and they talk to them about how there aren't any Jews in their town, but there used to be. Why aren't they there anymore? These are good people. One day, Sheila and I were out and about in Warsaw. We'd been to a chocolate cafe. It's a wonderful little place. And we were on our way back to the hotel. And we got turned around and we were lost. I don't think Sheila realized that she was depending on me to know where things are. She doesn't have a great sense of direction. But I said I got confused and turned around, and I actually got a little nervous. Here we are in this city. I barely speak the language. And suddenly I didn't know where we were. But there was a young woman walking toward us. And I stopped her and I had a little Polish conversation with her. And I told her that I thought we were lost. We were looking for Jabovska Street. That's where our hotel was. And I think she could see that I was a little nervous. And I think she could sense or she could tell that my Polish was pretty bad. I mean, I can't say much more than regard the rodent over there. And she could see that. So she was very kind, very supportive. And she said, "Oh, don't worry, you're going the right way. You'll get there. You just keep going down the street the way you're going. And you see that store on the corner there. Take a right, go down 2 blocks, and Zhabovska Street will be on your left. Very easy to find. Don't worry." So I thanked her and we continued on. After a moment, Sheila looked at me and she said, "Well, what was that about?" And I said, "Oh, well, I just felt like speaking a little Polish. So I was asking that woman if she knew what the weather was going to be like tomorrow." So we continued on. And after a few seconds, Sheila looked at me again and she said, "We're lost, aren't we?" And I looked at Sheila and I said, "Not anymore." So those good people in mind, the ones in the organization that talk to the little kids about the Jews who aren't in their towns anymore, and the nice young woman who helped us on the streets of Warsaw, and numerous others. With them in mind, I think a nice way for me to close here would be to read you the last line of George Eliot's novel, Middlemarch. "The growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been, is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. Thank you. Hag Shavuot Sameach and Sei gesund.